Bikers abuse a pregnant black woman in a wheelchair, unaware that Chris Hemsworth is watching them. What happened next shocked all the witnesses. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what you would do in Chris's shoes. Chris Hemsworth strolled through the park, enjoying the rare opportunity to escape the pressures of his fast-paced life. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the well-maintained paths lined with trees and benches. A light breeze rustled the leaves, creating a calming rhythm that contrasted with the chaos he was so accustomed to on movie sets and red carpets. He had spent the day at promotional events, shaking hands, posing for photos, and answering endless questions about upcoming projects. While he appreciated his career and the opportunities it afforded him, moments like this, peaceful, grounded, and away from the public eye, were becoming increasingly rare. The park felt like a sanctuary, offering him a chance to reconnect with himself and clear his mind. The path ahead curved gently, leading to a more secluded area of the park. Chris liked this particular spot because it offered privacy without feeling isolated. A few scattered joggers passed by, nodding politely, but otherwise the area was quiet. He appreciated that. Even if someone recognized him, they respected his space. As he rounded the bend, Chris noticed a group of people gathered near a bench. From a distance, it looked like a casual hangout, maybe friends sharing a laugh after work. But something about the scene unsettled him. The laughter carried an edge, sharp and mocking rather than joyful. He slowed his pace, instinctively scanning the group for details. It didn't take long for the situation to reveal itself. In the center of the group sat a woman in a wheelchair. She was visibly pregnant, her hands protectively resting on her stomach. Her expression was tense, her eyes darting between the men surrounding her. Chris noticed her dark skin and the way her features stiffened as the men leaned in closer. The group, 5 burly men clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and skull insignias, towered over her, their postures aggressive and predatory. One of them bent down, pretending to examine the wheelchair. Another gestured toward her stomach, saying something that made the others burst into laughter. The woman tried to back away, but the gravel under her wheels resisted, and her limited mobility only made her vulnerability more apparent. Chris's instincts sharpened. He had seen situations like this before, not in real life, but on screen. It was the kind of scenario that made viewers uncomfortable, angry even, but was easily dismissed as fiction. This wasn't fiction, though. The fear in the woman's eyes was real, and the tension in the air was thick enough to make his pulse quicken. The lead biker, distinguishable by the red snake tattoo that slithered up his neck, reached down and grabbed the handles of the wheelchair, tilting it slightly off balance. The woman gasped, clutching the armrests as if bracing for the worst. "Relax," one of the men said, though his tone was anything but reassuring. "We're just having a little fun." Chris took a step closer. He didn't want to escalate things too quickly, but every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. His mind raced through the possibilities. Call the police? No, they wouldn't get here in time. Confront them directly? That could push them over the edge. Still, standing by wasn't an option. He moved with purpose, closing the distance without drawing immediate attention to himself. As he approached, the laughter faded, and one of the men noticed him. "What's this?" the biker sneered, stepping forward as if to block Chris's path. Chris's eyes didn't leave the woman. Her gaze met his for a brief moment, and he saw it. Hope mixed with disbelief. "Evening," Chris said, keeping his voice steady. "Looks like you're making this lady a little uncomfortable." The lead biker straightened, his lips curling into a smirk. "And what's it to you, movie star?" Chris didn't flinch. He was used to people recognizing him, but this time it felt like more of a liability than an advantage. Still, he held his ground, refusing to let their mockery rattle him. "Just seems like you're outnumbering her," Chris replied, gesturing toward the group. "Thought maybe you could use someone your own size." The men exchanged glances, and for a moment, Chris thought he might have shifted the tone. But then the leader's smirk widened. "Oh, we're all about fair fights," he said, stepping closer. "Maybe we should see if you're as tough as you look in those action scenes." Chris felt his muscles tense, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of reacting to their taunts. Instead, he glanced back at the woman. "You okay?" he asked. Her voice wavered. I just want to go home." Chris nodded. "You will?" The leader laughed. "Not until we're done here." The other bikers closed in slightly, their boots crunching against the gravel. The shift was subtle but deliberate, an attempt to intimidate. Chris didn't budge. He let his body language speak for itself, standing tall and calm despite the rising tension. One of the men reached for the woman's bag, which was slung across the back of her chair. She tried to stop him, but he shoved her hand away. Chris stepped forward. "That's enough." The command in his voice caught them off guard, but only for a second. The leader's expression darkened, and Chris knew he had crossed a line. "You just made a big mistake," the biker growled. Chris didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, planting his feet and preparing for what was coming. The woman's breathing quickened, and Chris caught her eye again. "Stay calm," he said softly. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. The bikers spread out, forming a loose circle around him. Chris kept his movements minimal, conserving energy and watching for signs of who would make the first move. The leader cracked his knuckles. "Let's see what you've got." The air grew heavier, charged with the anticipation of violence. Chris knew there was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, he would have to be ready. And he was. Chris Hemsworth stood his ground, his sharp gaze fixed on the group of bikers who surrounded the pregnant woman in the wheelchair. The tension in the air felt almost physical, pressing against him like the weight of an unseen force. The leader of the group, the man with the red snake tattoo winding up his neck, stepped closer, a smug expression carved across his face. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent park. Behind Chris, the woman's breathing was shallow and rapid. Her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Chris didn't glance back at her, but he could feel the fear radiating off her like heat. It fueled his resolve. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let her come to harm. The lead biker tilted his head, sizing Chris up. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low but carrying a clear edge of menace. "You think you're some kind of hero? A movie star playing tough guy?" Chris's expression remained neutral. He had faced plenty of posturing men before, on movie sets and gyms and even at high-profile events where egos clashed like battering rams. This wasn't any different, at least not yet, but the stakes were higher now. "I'm just someone who doesn't like seeing people bullied," Chris replied, his voice calm but firm. The bikers laughed. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, took a step closer, pointing a finger at Chris's chest. "You hear that, boys? Captain America over here thinks he can tell us what to do." The group erupted into jeers and whistles, their mockery echoing through the park. But Chris didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the leader, who hadn't taken his gaze off him. "You've had your fun," Chris said, Now it's time to back off. The leader's smile disappeared. He stepped even closer, so close that Chris could smell the cheap alcohol and cigarettes on his breath. And if we don't? Chris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his stance, making it clear that he was ready for whatever came next. The leader noticed and sneered. "You really think you can take all of us?" Chris's voice dropped, calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Try me." The leader took a half step back, but his smirk quickly returned. He raised his hand, snapping his fingers. The other bikers began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate. The woman in the wheelchair let out a small gasp, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me go." The sound of her plea only seemed to embolden the group. One of the bikers reached down and grabbed her bag, yanking it free from the back of the chair. Items spilled onto the ground. Baby clothes, a bottle of water, a folded sonogram printout. Chris's eyes locked onto the scattered belongings, and something inside him snapped. He took a step forward, but the wiry man with the scar blocked his path. "Not so fast, pretty boy." Before Chris could respond, the man shoved him. It wasn't a hard push, more of a test to see if Chris would push back. And he did. Chris caught the man's wrist as it came toward him, twisting it sharply and forcing him to drop the chain he had been holding. The clang of metal hitting the ground seemed to signal the others, and suddenly the air erupted with movement. The leader lunged at Chris, aiming to grab him by the collar, but Chris sidestepped, planting his foot and shoving the man off balance. Another biker swung a punch, but Chris ducked, catching the man's arm and using his own momentum to throw him to the ground. The woman cried out as one of the bikers grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and began pushing her toward the edge of the path. Chris turned just in time to see it, and something primal ignited inside him. "Hey!" he shouted. He sprinted toward them, his movements swift and purposeful. The biker pushing the wheelchair turned, but it was too late. Chris grabbed him by the jacket and yanked him away, sending him stumbling to the ground. He then crouched down next to the woman, his voice low but steady. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head quickly, though tears streamed down her face. "Stay here," Chris said. "I won't let them touch you again." He turned back to the group, his posture radiating controlled aggression. The bikers hesitated, clearly reevaluating their chances, but the leader wasn't ready to back down. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the dim light. Chris's stomach tightened. He wasn't afraid of knives. He had trained to deal with them in countless fight sequences, but this wasn't a movie. One wrong move, and someone could get seriously hurt. "Last chance," Chris said, his voice low. "Walk away." The leader grinned, clearly mistaking Chris's words for fear. "No, pretty boy," he said, stepping closer. "This is your last chance." The knife flashed as he lunged, but Chris was ready. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it with enough force to make him drop the blade. The knife clattered to the ground, but before Chris could finish, another biker attacked from behind. Chris pivoted, catching the man's arm and driving his elbow into his ribs. The man let out a grunt and dropped to his knees, but there was no time to celebrate. Two more bikers came at him, forcing Chris to back up toward the woman. His muscles burned, but he didn't let it show. Years of training had prepared him for situations like this, moments where hesitation meant defeat. The leader, now weaponless but still defiant, pointed at Chris. "You're dead, Hemsworth. You don't walk away from this." Chris didn't reply. Instead, he raised his fists, silently daring them to make their move. But something shifted in the group. The bikers exchanged glances, their earlier bravado replaced by unease. One of them took a step back, then another. Even the leader seemed to hesitate. Chris didn't lower his guard, but he felt the shift. "Get out of here," he said. The leader spat at the ground, but the fight had drained out of him. He turned and stalked off, the others trailing behind him. As their footsteps faded, Chris let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned back to the woman, crouching beside her once more. "It's over," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered. Chris offered a small smile, but his mind was still racing. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. And as the shadows deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble would find him again before the night was through. Chris Hemsworth remained in a defensive stance, his eyes locked on the retreating backs of the bikers as they disappeared around the bend in the path. The pregnant woman in the wheelchair clutched the armrest, her breathing still rapid and uneven. The tension in her shoulders hadn't yet eased, even though the immediate threat seemed to have passed. But Chris knew better than to let his guard down. He had seen enough situations like this, whether in the controlled chaos of film stunts or moments of real-life confrontation, to know that trouble didn't always end when the aggressors walked away. Often it lingered, simmering beneath the surface until it flared up again, more dangerous than before. He crouched beside the woman, softening his tone to reassure her. "Are you sure you're okay?" She nodded quickly, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. They took my bag," she stammered. Her voice was shaky but determined. "It has my medication in it, and my phone." Chris's eyes flickered to the scattered belongings near the bench where the bikers had started their harassment. He stood, scanned the area to make sure none of them had doubled back, then walked briskly toward the pile. Most of the items had been dumped carelessly. A pack of tissues, a bottle of water, and a folded sonogram photo that had fluttered to the ground. Chris picked it up carefully, staring at the black and white image of a tiny figure curled in the womb. His jaw tightened. They weren't just bullying this woman. They had deliberately targeted someone vulnerable. Someone whose very life and the life of her unborn child depended on the contents of that bag. Chris collected everything he could find, returning to the woman and handing her the photo first. "Is this yours?" She nodded, tears springing to her eyes as she clutched the image to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Chris handed her the other items, but the bag itself was missing. "They must have taken it with them," he said. Her face fell, but before either of them could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed from the direction the bikers had gone. Chris's muscles tensed as he turned. The leader was back. This time, he wasn't alone. 4 of the bikers who had fled earlier were with him, and 2 of them were carrying weapons, one with a length of chain that glinted in the fading light, and another holding what looked like a steel pipe. Chris didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of the woman, shielding her from view as the group closed in. "Changed your mind?" Chris asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. The leader smirked. "You made a mistake, Hemsworth. Should have kept walking." The chain rattled as the man holding it gave it a threatening swing. Chris could see the tension in their shoulders, the way they sized him up like wolves circling prey. But Chris wasn't prey. The first man lunged, swinging the chain in a wide arc. Chris moved quickly, ducking low and stepping inside the swing. He caught the biker's wrist, twisting sharply and forcing him to drop the weapon. With a powerful shove, Chris sent the man stumbling back, then kicked the chain out of reach. Before he could regain his footing, another attacker came at him from the side, raising the steel pipe. Chris blocked the swing with his forearm, absorbing the impact before stepping in and driving his elbow into the man's ribs. The biker grunted, doubling over as the pipe fell from his hands. Chris followed up with a sharp shove, sending the second man crashing into the first. Both of them hit the ground in a heap. The leader barked an order, and the remaining bikers surged forward. Chris pivoted, catching the wrist of one man who tried to grab him from behind and twisting it until the biker cried out in pain. He swept the man's legs out from under him, dropping him hard onto the gravel. The woman in the wheelchair flinched as the chaos unfolded around her, but Chris kept himself positioned between her and the attackers, using his body as a barrier. The leader stepped closer, pulling out a knife. The blade gleamed in the dimming light, and Chris immediately adjusted his stance. "You don't want to do this," Chris said, his voice low and firm. But the leader didn't back down. He lunged. Chris sidestepped at the last moment, catching the man's arm and twisting it. The knife clattered to the ground, but the leader was quick. Too quick to let Chris finish him off in one move. He shoved back hard, creating distance and reaching for the knife again. Chris kicked it away, sending it skidding across the pavement. The leader roared in frustration and charged again, but Chris was ready. He caught him mid-stride, lifting him off the ground and slamming him down in a controlled but forceful maneuver. The impact echoed through the park, and the remaining bikers froze. For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader groaned, clutching his ribs as he rolled onto his side. "Enough," Chris said, his voice ringing out across the space. "This is over." The bikers hesitated, their confidence shattered. One by one, they began backing away, their eyes darting between Chris and their fallen leader. The man with the chain was the first to retreat, turning and disappearing down the path. The others followed, muttering curses under their breath as they fled into the night. Chris didn't lower his guard until the last of them had vanished. Only then did he turn back to the woman crouching beside her. "They're gone," he said softly. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "I thought, you're safe now." Chris gave her a reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." He helped her straighten the wheelchair, then glanced around to make sure they weren't being followed. "We should call the police," Chris said. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "My phone was in the bag." Chris pulled out his own phone and dialed, keeping one eye on the path as he spoke to the dispatcher. "They'll be here soon," he said once the call ended. The woman reached for his arm. "I don't know how to thank you." Chris shook his head. "You don't have to." But as he stood and scanned the shadows once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't finished. Not yet. The night's silence had been replaced by the fading hum of retreating footsteps, but Chris Hemsworth remained alert. His muscles, still tense from the confrontation, refused to relax. He scanned the shadows of the park for any lingering threats, unwilling to assume that the bikers were truly gone. The woman in the wheelchair, still clutching the sonogram photo, looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. The tears that had welled earlier now trailed down her cheeks, leaving faint glistening streaks in the dim light. "They're gone," Chris reassured her, though even as he said the words, a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. "But we're not staying here. Let's get you somewhere safe." Before she could respond, a sound echoed through the park, a sharp whistle cutting through the night air. Chris froze. The woman stiffened, her knuckles tightening on the armrests of her chair. "Is that?" she began, her voice trembling. Chris didn't let her finish. He already knew the answer. "They're back," he said grimly. He positioned himself between her and the direction of the sound, his body once again forming a protective barrier. The footsteps returned, heavier this time, accompanied by the metallic clinking of chains and the unmistakable sound of a bat scraping against concrete. The leader emerged first, his red snake tattoo almost glowing in the faint light. He was flanked by 6 men now, their faces harder and their weapons more obvious. One carried a length of pipe, another held a chain, and a third had a broken bottle in his hand. Chris didn't flinch. "I told you," the leader sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over." Chris didn't respond right away. He let the tension build, forcing the bikers to wait. He knew enough about intimidation to understand that silence could be as powerful as words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Walk away," Chris said. The leader barked a harsh laugh. "Or what? You'll call the cops? Too late for that, hero. We're finishing this now." Chris shifted his weight, subtly adjusting his stance. He didn't want to fight, not really, but he was prepared. The bikers were trying to overwhelm him with numbers, but he could tell they weren't trained fighters. They relied on fear and brute force. Unfortunately for them, Chris was neither afraid nor inexperienced. The leader gave the signal, and the first attacker lunged. Chris moved quickly, sidestepping the swing of the pipe and catching the man's arm. He twisted sharply, forcing the weapon from his grip and sending it clattering to the ground. With one fluid motion, Chris shoved the man backward, knocking him into another attacker and sending them both sprawling. The next man came at him with the broken bottle, slashing wildly. Chris ducked the first swipe and deflected the second with his forearm before delivering a sharp elbow strike to the attacker's ribs. The man doubled over, dropping the bottle, and Chris followed up with a swift kick that sent him stumbling back. But there was no time to celebrate. 2 more men came at him from opposite sides, one swinging a chain and the other brandishing a knife. Chris ducked low, letting the chain whip over his head, and then grabbed the wrist of the man with the knife. The blade glinted dangerously close, but Chris used the man's momentum against him, twisting the arm and forcing the knife to the ground. He delivered a hard knee to the man's stomach, dropping him to his knees before turning to face the next attacker. The man with the chain hesitated, clearly second-guessing his decision, but Chris didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanked it free, and sent the attacker sprawling with a powerful shove. The leader, who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward. "You're tougher than I thought," he admitted, pulling a knife from his jacket. "But let's see how you handle this." Chris didn't move, keeping his focus squarely on the weapon. The knife wasn't the real threat. The man holding it was. And Chris could see the desperation in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that betrayed his confidence. The leader lunged, but Chris was faster. He sidestepped the thrust, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard enough to make him drop the blade. The knife clattered to the ground, and Chris followed up with a sharp jab to the man's stomach, forcing him to stagger back. But the leader wasn't done. He recovered quickly, grabbing a bat from one of his men and swinging it in a wide arc. Chris ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as the bat passed inches from his head. He lunged forward, catching the leader off guard and driving his shoulder into the man's chest. The leader fell hard, but before Chris could finish him, another attacker charged. Chris turned, catching the man's arm and flipping him over his shoulder in a controlled throw. The attacker hit the ground with a grunt, groaning in pain as he struggled to get up. The fight continued, each move precise and deliberate. Chris wasn't wasting energy, he was conserving it, using the biker's momentum against them and keeping himself between them and the woman. She watched with wide eyes, clutching the edges of her chair as if bracing for impact. Chris spared her a quick glance, making sure she was still safe, but the momentary distraction almost cost him. The leader recovered, grabbing the knife again and charging. Chris spun, catching his arm and twisting it sharply. The knife fell to the ground once more, and Chris followed up with a powerful kick that sent the man sprawling. The leader lay on the ground, coughing and groaning, but Chris didn't relax. He turned back to the others, daring them to make another move, but they didn't. One by one, the bikers began retreating, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of Chris's unshakable determination. The leader glared up at him, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. Chris didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, watching as the group finally scattered into the night. When the last of them disappeared, Chris let out a slow breath and turned back to the woman. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "You—" She swallowed, struggling to find the words. "You saved my life." Chris crouched beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. He had won the fight, but the war wasn't over yet. And as the night stretched on, Chris knew he had to stay vigilant, for her safety and his own. Chris Hemsworth stood over the fallen leader of the bikers, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths despite the adrenaline still surging through his veins. The dim lights from the park's lampposts cast long shadows across the scene, highlighting the scattered debris and weapons left behind by the retreating attackers. The pregnant woman in the wheelchair hadn't moved, her hands still gripping the armrest so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Stay with me," Chris said, his voice calm but firm as he turned toward her. "We're not out of this yet." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear but filled with an emerging trust. Chris glanced down at the leader, who groaned as he shifted on the ground. Despite the pain evident on his face, the man's eyes burned with hatred. "You're dead, Hemsworth," the leader spat, his voice strained but defiant. "You don't walk away from this." Chris didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he stepped back, positioning himself between the woman and the biker. He knew better than to let his guard down. The group had already come back once, stronger and more prepared, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't try again. Suddenly, movement in the shadows caught his attention. Chris tensed as two more bikers emerged from the trees, weapons in hand. One carried a crowbar, the other a length of rebar. They looked nervous, but desperation made them dangerous. "Seriously?" Chris muttered under his breath, his body shifting instinctively into a defensive stance. The biker with the crowbar lunged first, swinging the weapon in a wide arc. Chris sidestepped the attack, catching the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The crowbar clattered to the ground, and Chris followed up with a quick strike to the man's chest, sending him sprawling backward. The second attacker didn't hesitate, thrusting the rebar toward Chris's midsection. Chris pivoted, letting the strike miss by inches before grabbing the weapon and wrenching it free. With a swift motion, he swung it low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. Both bikers were down, groaning as they clutched their injuries. Chris wasted no time in disarming them completely, kicking their weapons far out of reach. Behind him, the leader tried to rise again, but Chris turned sharply, his presence alone enough to freeze the man in place. "Don't," Chris warned, his voice low and dangerous. The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between Chris and his fallen men. He was calculating, looking for an opening, but Chris didn't give him one. "Get up," Chris said, gesturing to the remaining bikers, "and get out of here before you dig yourselves into a deeper hole." The leader bared his teeth in a sneer, but Chris could see the cracks forming in his confidence. Still, the man didn't move. "Fine," Chris said, stepping closer. "Then I'll help you." In one swift motion, he grabbed the leader by the collar, hauling him to his feet. The man struggled, but Chris's grip was unrelenting. "Let me make this clear," Chris said, his voice sharp. "If you come back here, or if you ever go after her again, I won't stop next time. You get me?" The leader's bravado faltered. He nodded quickly, his breathing ragged. Chris shoved him back toward his men who were already scrambling to their feet. "Go!" They didn't need to be told twice. One by one, they staggered off into the darkness, leaving behind only the faint sound of their retreating footsteps. Chris turned back to the woman, crouching beside her. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her breathing still uneven. Yes, I think so." Chris scanned her face, searching for any signs of injury, but aside from the fear in her eyes, she appeared unharmed. "We need to get you out of here," he said, rising to his feet and gently gripping the handles of her wheelchair. "Can you hold on?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice steadier now. Chris began pushing the wheelchair towards the park's exit, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead and behind them. He didn't trust that the bikers wouldn't come back, or that there weren't others lurking nearby. The night seemed darker now, the trees casting longer shadows that danced with each flicker of the streetlights. Chris's muscles remained coiled, ready for another attack. Halfway to the exit, the woman finally spoke again. "Why did you help me?" Chris didn't answer right away. He could feel her eyes on him, searching for an explanation. "Because no one else did," he said finally. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling as they rested against her stomach. "They said I didn't belong here," she whispered. Chris's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much from the start, the slurs, the threats, the way they had singled her out. But hearing her confirm it only fueled the fire already burning inside him. "Well, they're wrong," he said. "You do." The woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "They'll come back," she said softly. "People like that always do." Chris didn't deny it. "Maybe," he said, "but so will I." They reached the edge of the park, where the dim glow of streetlights gave way to the brighter glare of passing traffic. Chris flagged down a car and explained the situation to the driver, who agreed to stay with the woman until the police arrived. Before Chris left, she grabbed his hand. "What's your name?" "Chris," he said with a smile. "I'm Lena," she replied, her voice steadier now. "Nice to meet you, Lena," Chris said, "and don't worry, I'll make sure those guys don't bother anyone else." As the car pulled away, Chris turned back toward the park, his shoulders squared and his expression hardening. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The car, carrying Lena, disappeared down the street, its tail lights fading into the darkness. Chris Hemsworth stood at the edge of the park, his shoulders still squared, his breathing steady but shallow as the adrenaline coursing through his veins began to fade. He should have felt relief, knowing Lena was safe for the moment, but his instincts wouldn't let him relax. Something about the way the bikers had retreated nagged at him. It hadn't felt like surrender. It felt like regrouping. The park was eerily quiet now. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves were the only sounds that broke the silence. Chris's eyes scanned the shadows between the trees, his ears tuned to the slightest noise. The bikers had already proven they weren't above returning with reinforcements, and he wasn't about to be caught off guard again. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Lena, sent from the borrowed phone in the car. "Thank you." I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Please be careful." Chris smiled faintly but didn't respond. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned his attention back to the path leading deeper into the park. Something felt wrong, unfinished. And then he heard it, the sound of boots grinding against gravel. He turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the figures emerging from the darkness. The leader of the gang, the man with the red snake tattoo, was back. This time, he wasn't alone. At least 8 new bikers followed him, forming a semicircle around Chris and cutting off his path to the street. Their weapons were more menacing now. Knives, bats, chains, and even a crowbar glinted under the dim light of the street lamps. The leader stepped forward, his face contorted in rage. Blood stained the corner of his mouth from their earlier fight, but his eyes burned with determination. "I told you this wasn't over," he snarled, his voice echoing in the stillness. Chris didn't flinch. "Looks like you brought friends this time," Chris said evenly, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against him. "You embarrassed me," the leader spat, his hand flexing over the hilt of the knife tucked into his belt. "Made me look weak in front of my crew." He gestured toward the new men who smirked and cracked their knuckles. "I can't let that stand." Chris's gaze swept over the group, quickly assessing their positions and weapons. They were trying to box him in, leaving him with no clear path to escape. It was a deliberate strategy, but it also showed they were afraid of facing him one-on-one. That gave him an edge, however small. "Walk away," Chris said again, though he knew the offer would be ignored. The leader grinned, pulling the knife from his belt and flipping it in his hand. "I don't think so." Without warning, he lunged. Chris dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade as it sliced through the air. He grabbed the leader's wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing the knife to drop to the ground with a metallic clatter. But before Chris could follow through, another biker swung a bat toward his head. Chris ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as the bat missed by inches. He grabbed the attacker's arm, yanked him off balance, and sent him crashing into one of his own men. The 2 bikers stumbled, giving Chris a brief opening, but the others were already moving in. 2 men attacked from opposite sides, one swinging a chain, the other wielding a crowbar. Chris stepped into the chain's arc, catching it before it could wrap around him. With a sharp tug, he yanked it free and swung it back, knocking the second man's crowbar aside. The impact reverberated through his arm, but he didn't stop. Chris pressed forward, disarming the man with the crowbar and shoving him to the ground. Another attacker lunged, this one holding a broken bottle. Chris sidestepped, deflecting the strike with his forearm before delivering a powerful punch to the man's jaw. The attacker crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. But Chris didn't have time to celebrate. The leader recovered, grabbing a bat and swinging wildly. Chris ducked, catching the bat mid-swing and wrenching it free. With one swift motion, he slammed the handle into the leader's stomach, doubling him over. The other bikers hesitated, their earlier confidence now replaced with doubt. But the leader wasn't finished. He staggered back, wiping blood from his mouth before pulling out a second knife. "You're dead," he roared, charging again. Chris braced himself, waiting until the last possible second before sidestepping and catching the leader's wrist. He twisted it sharply, forcing the knife to drop once more, and then followed up with a powerful kick to the man's chest. The leader hit the ground hard, coughing as the air was knocked from his lungs. Chris stepped over him, planting a foot firmly on his chest to keep him down. "This is over," Chris said, his voice low but commanding. The remaining bikers froze, their eyes darting between Chris and their fallen leader. One by one, They began backing away, their weapons lowered. The leader glared up at Chris, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. "You're done," Chris repeated, stepping back and letting the man struggle to his feet. "Now get out of here before I change my mind." The bikers hesitated a moment longer, but then they turned and fled, dragging their leader with them. The sound of their footsteps faded into the night, leaving Chris standing alone in the park. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his muscles finally easing. His phone buzzed again. "Did you make it out okay?" It was Lena. Chris allowed himself a small smile as he typed back a response. "All clear. They won't bother anyone again." But even as he sent the message, Chris knew the events of the night would stay with him. The fight might have been over, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would linger. And as he turned and began walking toward the park's exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd be called to stand up against injustice. For now, though, he was content knowing that Lena and her unborn child were safe, and that he had proven, once again, that being a hero wasn't about playing a role on screen. It was about showing up when it mattered most. The sound of retreating footsteps gradually faded, leaving Chris Hemsworth alone in the park. His shoulders ached, his muscles burned, and faint bruises were already forming along his arms. Yet, despite the physical toll, his mind remained sharp, scanning the empty spaces between the trees for any lingering threats. The night felt heavier now, as though the tension that had permeated the air refused to dissipate completely. Chris exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the quiet. He knew the fight was over, but the weight of the moment lingered. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, already expecting another message from Lena, but instead it was an unknown number. "This isn't over. You're going to pay for tonight." Chris's grip on the phone tightened. He had no doubt the message was from the leader of the bikers, a desperate attempt to reclaim control after his humiliating defeat. Chris's jaw tensed, but he quickly dismissed the threat. Cowards barked from the shadows. They rarely had the courage to bite once exposed. Still, he took a screenshot of the message, forwarding it to the police dispatcher who had responded earlier. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Sirens echoed in the distance, their red and blue lights cutting through the darkness as two police cars turned into the park's entrance. Chris lowered his phone and straightened his posture, stepping away from the debris left by the fight. He recognized the officers stepping out of the cars. Both had the focused expressions of people who had seen more than their share of trouble. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached first. A stocky man with a closely trimmed beard, he had the calm authority of someone who had dealt with chaos before. "Mr. Hemsworth?" Daniels asked, his eyes quickly scanning the area, and then locking onto Chris. "That's me," Chris replied, his voice steady. Daniels nodded, clearly recognizing him but treating him with professional detachment. "We got a call about an incident involving multiple suspects. Is anyone hurt?" Chris gestured toward the ground where weapons still lay scattered. "No serious injuries, but they came at me armed." Daniel's partner, Officer Reyes, crouched to examine the discarded weapons. He pulled out a small evidence bag and began collecting them while Daniels focused on Chris. "Witnesses said you were defending a woman," Daniels continued. "Where is she now?" "She's safe. I got her out of here before they came back for round 2. Daniels's expression darkened. "They came back?" Chris nodded. "With reinforcements, about 8 more guys, same gang." Reyes let out a low whistle as he rose, holding up the broken bottle and the knife that had been left behind. You're telling me you took down all of them? Chris shrugged. Didn't leave me much of a choice. Daniels glanced toward the path where the bikers had fled, then back at Chris. We've been trying to pin something on these guys for months. They've been running drugs, intimidating locals, mostly targeting people they think can't fight back. Well, tonight they picked the wrong target, Chris said. Daniels allowed himself the briefest smile before his expression turned serious again. We'll need statements, yours and the woman's. Can you get us her contact information? Chris pulled out his phone, showing them Lena's number. Daniels jotted it down, then paused. You realize they're not going to let this go, right? Guys like that don't handle humiliation well. Chris met his eyes. Neither do I. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll get units to patrol the area in case they come back tonight. But if they contact you, or if you see them again, call us immediately. Chris agreed, though he doubted he'd wait around for backup if the gang tried anything else. As the officers finished their work, Chris leaned against a nearby lamppost, finally allowing himself a moment to process everything that had happened. The fight, the threats, the fear in Lena's eyes, it all played back in his mind like scenes from a movie. Only this time, there were no cameras, no directors yelling, "Cut." It was raw, unpredictable, and real. The officers eventually loaded the collected evidence into their cars and prepared to leave. Daniels handed Chris a card. Call if you need anything. Thanks. The cars pulled away, their flashing lights receding into the distance. Chris remained in the park for a while longer, letting the silence settle over him. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lena. The police called. They asked me questions about what happened. I told them everything. Are you okay? Chris smiled faintly and typed back. I'm fine. Don't worry. They won't be bothering you anymore. Her reply came almost immediately. Thank you again. For everything. I don't know how I can ever repay you. You don't have to. Chris slipped his phone back into his pocket and finally turned to leave the park. His legs felt heavier now, the adrenaline finally fading and leaving behind the exhaustion of a body pushed to its limits. But as he walked, he couldn't help replaying the events in his head. The bikers' aggression, their confidence, and the way it crumbled under pressure. It reminded him how quickly power shifted when someone refused to back down. He thought about Lena, about her courage despite her fear. She hadn't run, even when things looked hopeless, and that strength reminded him of why he had stepped in, because real strength wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about standing up when it mattered most, when the odds were against you and fear was all you could feel. By the time Chris reached his car, the streets were quiet again. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel. The weight of the night lingered, but so did the knowledge that he had done the right thing. His phone buzzed one last time, a notification about Lena's statement being processed. The police had her back now, but Chris still made a mental note to check on her in the morning. For now, he started the engine and pulled away, leaving the park behind. But he knew the memory of this night would stay with him, proof that sometimes heroes didn't wear capes or costumes. Sometimes they just showed up when no one else would. Chris Hemsworth sat in his car, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The hum of the engine filled the silence, but his thoughts were far louder. The night had ended, but the echoes of what had happened in the park lingered. The tension in his shoulders refused to ease, even as the lights of the city blurred past his windows. The text messages from Lena replayed in his mind. Her gratitude had been genuine, but Chris couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. He had fought off the bikers, protected her from immediate harm, but what about the long-term danger? Could he really guarantee her safety now that he had exposed himself as a threat to their gang? His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was another message from Lena. I made it home safe. The police stayed until I got inside. They told me they'll check in tomorrow, too. I can't stop thinking about tonight. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Chris exhaled slowly. She was safe. That was what mattered most. He typed back quickly. I'm just glad you're okay. Get some rest. I'll check in tomorrow. But even as he sent the message, he felt the weight of the night settle in deeper. He had seen the hate in the leader's eyes, heard the venom in his threats. This wasn't over for them. Not yet. When Chris finally arrived home, the silence of his house felt heavier than usual. He dropped his keys on the counter and sank into the couch, his muscles aching from the fight. He rubbed at the bruise forming on his arm and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For years, Chris had been known as the strong, unshakable hero on screen. Fans cheered his characters, celebrated his victories, and admired his strength. But tonight had been different. There were no cameras, no scripts, just real people and real danger. And, as much as he tried to shake it off, the weight of responsibility felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Lena. It was a notification, his name trending online. Curiosity tugged at him and he opened the app. His stomach tightened as he saw the first post. Chris Hemsworth, real-life hero. Actor steps in to protect pregnant woman from gang attack. Attached to the post was a grainy video, clearly recorded by one of the bystanders during the confrontation. It captured the moment Chris had faced off against the gang, his movements precise, his demeanor unshaken. The clip had already gone viral, with thousands of comments pouring in. This is what a real hero looks like. Thor in real life. Chris Hemsworth didn't just play a hero, he is one. Chris groaned, running a hand down his face. He had hoped the incident wouldn't attract attention, but, of course, it had. In the age of smartphones and social media, privacy was an illusion. His phone buzzed again, this time a call from his manager. Chris hesitated before answering. "You're everywhere right now," his manager said without preamble. "The internet's blowing up about what happened tonight." "It's not what it looks like," Chris replied, already anticipating the questions. "I didn't plan this, You just saved someone's life," his manager cut in. "You need to own this. People are already calling you a hero. Don't fight it." Chris leaned forward, rubbing his temples. He wasn't comfortable with the attention, not for this. It wasn't a movie premiere or a staged charity event. It was real. "It's not about being a hero," Chris said finally. "It's about doing the right thing. And that's exactly why people are responding the way they are," his manager replied. "They need to see this, to see that courage exists in real life. You don't have to play it up, but don't downplay it either." After ending the call, Chris scrolled through the comments. Some praised him, others questioned if it was staged, and a few criticized him for getting involved in something dangerous. But one comment stood out. "I hope Lena and her baby are okay. She's the real hero for standing up to them in the first place." Chris paused, reading the words again. It wasn't about him. It never had been. Lena had faced danger with nothing but courage and determination to survive. She hadn't run. She had stood her ground, even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. The next morning, Chris drove to Lena's apartment complex. He called ahead to let her know he was coming, and she greeted him at the door with a hesitant smile. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," she admitted. Chris smiled softly. "I told you I'd check in." She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was small but tidy, decorated with soft colors and pictures of her family. Chris noticed the sonogram photo taped to the fridge. "Thank you again," Lena said, "for everything." Before Chris could respond, she reached for a folded piece of paper on the table. "I made this for you," she said, handing it to him. Chris unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he took in the image. It was a hand-drawn picture of him standing protectively in front of Lena, facing off against the bikers. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "My hero." Chris felt his throat tighten. He looked up at Lena, who smiled despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "I wanted you to know what it meant," she said, "to me, to my baby. You didn't just save us, you gave me hope." Chris carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "You're the real hero," he said. "You didn't give up. That's what matters." As he left her apartment, Chris felt something shift inside him. The weight of the night hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow. He had done the right thing, not because he wanted recognition, but because it was necessary. And as he drove away, the picture tucked safely in his jacket, Chris knew this was a moment he'd never forget. Not because the world had seen it, but because it reminded him of what it truly meant to be strong. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up when others couldn't. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you like this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Share this video with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in such a situation? And don't forget to watch other videos on our channel. Support us by liking and reposting. It helps to create more stories like this.